Hey everyone, I'm Kira Noodleman and I work at B Partners. We are a firm that believes machines will win, and what I mean by that is they're already winning with complexity and speed and data and precision, and we also believe that humans will always own flexibility and compassion and instinct and purpose. And we look at a lot of frontier technologies, and within that broader umbrella, I've personally focused quite a bit on blockchain. And so I'm here to talk to you today about blockchain for impact. So to get us started, let's talk about what blockchain is and why we should even care. It is an immutable, indelible, decentralized ledger of transactions, and there is a method of consensus that happens where transactions are appended and added to the ledger. And what this consensus mechanism does for us is it eliminates the possibility of double spend. So you can think about Bitcoin being like email for money, but with email, we can send thousands of emails. So if you could do that with money, none of this would make sense. And so it basically creates a digitally scarce resource with this consensus mechanism. And it introduces all kinds of really interesting business models and completely brand new markets. I'm sure you guys have heard about blockchain by now. It has transformative potential, and kind of everybody right now is talking about it. It's governments, it's central banks, it's enterprises, it's startups, you name it, people are having a conversation and being pretty thoughtful of what's happening. And I want to ground us with the evolution to an extent, which is that in 2009, when blockchain emerged through its first instantiation, which is Bitcoin, you could buy one pizza with 10,000 Bitcoin. Now, last year in 2018, one of a blockchain messaging company called Telegram raised $1.3 billion in an initial coin offering. And so that accretion of value is pretty insane. And the initial coin offering is known as an ICO, and to date, there have been $20 billion raised in this mechanism. So people, you can imagine, are really paying attention. And to give you a little bit of context, in 2018, there was $100 billion invested into venture capital funding. There are 4 signs you might want to use the blockchain. The first of which, a database is needed. Second, the database has multiple writers. You can imagine at this point, we're talking about most businesses. You don't trust all the writers, and you don't want a trusted intermediary. And that last piece is really the important piece here. It's like, usually there's someone in the middle that can manage all of this, and with blockchain, you actually don't need that. So let's talk about impact insights around blockchain. The Stanford GSB did a study last year, and they looked at 193 different projects. And here's a few important salient details. First of which, 74% of these are still in the pilot stage, or were at the time, and 34% started in 2017. So this is pretty brand new. The best case scenario, in my perspective as an investor, is that blockchain is necessary and mission critical for this project to take off. And so only 20% of these opportunities actually have that characteristic. And from where I sit, you don't ever want to have technology searching for a problem. So I would argue a lot of these projects actually are in that department. And lastly, blockchain for impact is most often used to facilitate payments and verify records. And another piece of information is that 25% of the projects they looked at were focused on health, and then 12 and 13% were focused on financial inclusion and energy, climate, and the environment. There are a lot of broader blockchain initiatives happening as well. 2 of the biggest groups working on them are the United Nations and the World Bank. The United Nations, as some of you might have been hearing, separate from blockchain, has social development goals, sustainable development goals, or SDGs. There's 17 of them. They were set up in 2016. The 193 UN member states have committed to trying to, and not just trying, but working to achieve those goals by 2030. And a lot of groups like Consensus for Social Impact are using the SDGs as their North Star for how they want to track impact. And Consensus is the group around Ethereum that's investing in their ecosystem. The World Bank, which issues $60 billion worth of bonds a year, recently dabbled into blockchain and produced a $73 million bond with the Australian Commonwealth Bank. So they're getting started as well. And I included Positive Blockchain up there because that is a website that has 800 different social impact projects focused on blockchain. So it's pretty interesting to take a look at just the wide range of what's out there. Let's talk about the first use case, which is financial inclusion and identity. Now, when blockchain first came around about 10 years ago, people really thought Bitcoin was going to disrupt the financial markets in emerging economies. And this is because there was censorship resistance, there's really low barriers to entry, low fees, it offers 24/7 access to markets and assets that otherwise would not be there. So it seemed like it would make a lot of sense, right? What has been interesting to learn is that actually technology penetration is not what can always be the driver of financial inclusion. And in this case, the number one reason that people, this is a survey from the World Bank, don't have bank accounts is actually because they don't have enough money. So it actually has nothing to do with the technology and whether it's available to people or not. And so without income, how can we bank the unbanked? It's actually just not possible, right? So the other piece here too, just to add some color, is that about 5 years ago, 1 of 7 billion people on this planet had access to a smartphone and therefore internet. And now that number is about 51%, which is so much better, but still, when you think about a lot of these financial inclusion products, they are lacking the right product context for users, or it's in English, or the user experience just isn't quite there. And then if you bring blockchain into the picture, you have to think about things like private keys to manage custody of your digital assets, or token volatility, where Bitcoin last year went from it ranging to be worth $5,000 a Bitcoin to $20,000 in Bitcoin. So, you know, it's easy to see why this isn't easy for people to just jump right in. And identity, I would argue, is the single biggest impediment, actually, to financial inclusion. And so why identity? There are 1.5 billion people on this planet that don't actually have access to a formal identity, and 40% of them are low income. There's 161 countries that rely on technology-enabled identity solutions, yet a lot of these groups, whether it's online or not, there's a lot of manual process and inspection and bureaucracy and red tape. And so it's hard for people to access and prove their identities. And a good example is in India, there's a program called Aadhaar, and it's meant to enable and subsidize food for low-income people. But those people, to access that food, need to prove their identity, and many of them are unable to do so. So it's a pretty big starting point problem. If you're not feeding yourself, if you're not able to generate an income, you know, how can you worry about a bank account? So the two characteristics that I would draw out of why blockchain for identity are self-sovereign identity and the fact that there's no singular point of failure on the blockchain. When I say self-sovereign identity, I'm referring to all of us owning our own identity information. There's two projects I want to mention. There's Uport and there's Civic. And what they enable is this ownership of our own identity information. Some people call that Web 3.0. But what it means is that it's not the state telling us this is who you are, you know, with our driver's license or our social security number, but rather it's perhaps schools or workplaces or municipal offices that can verify attributes to our identity. Now, the other point here is about reducing the singular point of failure. And most of us know about the Equifax hack, where 145 million Americans had their identity data breached. And the way to think about this is that there was a castle that was broken into. There was one place to go, and these hackers were able to do it. But with a distributed system that blockchain is an example of, you would have to break into an entire city or an entire country, or 145 million people's homes to get that same data. So you can see the power there. So basically, identity can be a huge breakthrough to financial inclusion, and I see it as a starting point. The second use case I want to talk about is energy, climate, and the environment. Now, there's about $300 million invested into this space. I'll give a few examples in a moment. And there's two archetypes that I would draw out here on the types of projects that are really out there at the moment. One is around peer-to-peer transaction grids. And so energy production is becoming more local. There's more regional markets, and I'm talking about solar panels and wind farms and people producing their own energy, and they're able to then sell excess energy to the grid, to another business, to another peer-to-peer, to another homeowner. That's starting to happen, and what that's doing is reducing reliance on centralized grids. The second archetype is around grid transactions on centralized grids. And right now there's a key challenge to produce a fair market, and that's because there's a lot of middlemen in the mix who are in charge of the billing and the fees, and they're taking an inordinate amount of economic rent. And so on the blockchain, there's more transparency. You ultimately really do take out the intermediaries, and so it's not that these people still won't have some value that they'll receive, but with blockchain, we can imagine that it would be a more appropriate value to the value that they're producing. And another idea is that a homeowner could actually access more than one energy source. So they could access a regional market, a centralized grid from a peer. Right now, that's actually not possible. Another interesting idea is if we all had IoT devices in our homes, we would first have a better sense of actually the energy we're consuming, and then with a blockchain marketplace that I've been talking about, we could, on a routine basis, be making our own energy purchases and understanding what we're consuming to inform those decisions. And with predictive analytics, we could do so pretty seamlessly. So a lot of interesting possibilities here. One other that's actually not on this list is about emission-related data. So we could talk about on a project level, a facility level, on a program level, on a country level. But if we had globally shared access to emission data, it could really be a game changer in terms of how we set goals and how we track them, and how we hold people accountable. A few examples of the energy projects out there are one called Transactive Grid. It's with LO3 Energy and Siemens, and it's enabling people in Brooklyn to resell their energy that they're producing on solar panels, or if any of them have wind turbines, back into the grid. Fujitsu has a new patent around a product that helps their enterprise customers trade energy, and they've shared that they expect, or they've seen a boost in energy distribution by 40%, so very significant. And it's not actually limited to green energy, although I've been mentioning that. So BP, Shell, a few others have produced a consortium. It's called VACT, and they're actually trading oil on the blockchain. So looking ahead, adoption timelines are very much going to vary across the type of projects we're talking about. Per the Stanford study last year, they had a number that 55% of these initiatives were going to have some kind of impact to their end consumer by early 2019, so that's now. One example I want to call out as being the most impressive traction to date that I've seen is in humanitarian aid. And so there's a World Food Program with the UN that actually was supporting Syrian refugees as they fled and were in Jordan and Lebanon. And they were given Ethereum-based vouchers to access resources, food, money from relatives, and the UN is going to scale this globally, which is incredible, and they're going to work with Microsoft and Hyperledger. Financial inclusion identity, the adoption there is going to be driven by the need to reduce leakages and increase operational efficiencies. Once we can track people in a more efficient way, the types of financial products that are available are going to be, I think, are going to be incredible. And lastly, with energy, climate, and the environment, this is going to be a slow one because we're talking about state-owned utilities and regulators. There's grassroots initiatives thus far, but it's bits and pieces. And I really believe this development is going to occur alongside other technology developing, like AI, like IoT. But the core value here is about energy trading and how that might change these markets. And so with that, I'm really excited to see the evolution of these projects and social impact supported by blockchain, and thank you for listening.